Hello, I'm Emma Louise Coffey and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. On this week's episode, grassland researcher Deirdre explains with 40% less nitrogen, you can still maintain grass production and increase milk solids per cow in the region of 30 kilos. And I started by asking her about the benefits of white clover use for this system.
Okay, so white clover is a legume, which means it can fix nitrogen and make it available for plant growth. And I suppose that's one of, if we think of sustainability, that's one of the key areas. If we have nitrogen available within the system, then we don't need to apply extra fertiliser nitrogen. So the other main benefit of having clover in your sward is that it's a high quality feed. It's higher quality than perennial ryegrass. So that brings up the overall quality of the diet. And say, for example, this time of the year when perennial ryegrass starts to go stemmy, white clover content in the sward is starting to increase. And if we compare the quality of a grass only or a mixture of grass only and white clover at this time of the year, we will see that the quality of the mixed sward is higher. So in terms of, for the farmer, what that means is that they're less likely to suffer a big drop in protein in their milk. They may still get some drop, but it'll probably be to a lesser extent. So I suppose overall the two main advantages of having white clover are that it's high quality feed and it maintains that quality through the season, and also it fixes nitrogen so we can apply less fertiliser nitrogen.
So delve into that. We'll pick up on all those points that you've made, Deirdre. In terms of fixing nitrogen, you've done some research in Moorpark on that. Can you talk us through, I suppose, what you looked at and the results? Yeah.
So I suppose we started off a few years ago with plot type studies, but they were grazed. So we had big plots. They were 8 metres by 8 metres. And we looked at a whole range of fertiliser application rates on those, 0 all the way up to 240 kilos per hectare per year. And we compared grass only versus grass clover swards. And we found that we got an increase in herbage production once we had clover in the sward, regardless of the fertiliser application rate. And based on our calculations in terms of the amount of nitrogen that was fixed, it went from about 50 kilos at the high nitrogen application rate up to about 200 kilos at the low nitrogen application or the no nitrogen application rate. So I suppose the trend in general is that the higher the nitrogen application rate, the lower the quantity of nitrogen fixed. And then we've completed a 4-year study where we've looked at grass only swards getting 250 kilos of nitrogen as our baseline type system, and then we've had a system with grass clover getting 250. So only difference there is that we had clover added to the sward, and then we had a third treatment where we had grass clover and we reduced the nitrogen input to 150 kilos. And we ran all those systems at 2.74 cows per hectare, so we had the same stocking rate, and we imposed the same grazing management rules, so same rotation length, same post-grazing sward height, same target pre-grazing herbage mass and so on. So the only differences were whether we had or didn't have clover in the system or the rate of fertiliser applied. And I suppose what's really interesting in this is for 4 years under cow grazing, so full grazing season, February to November, we found that we grew the same amount of herbage or the same amount of grass regardless of the fertiliser rate. So really what that's telling us that in a well-managed grass clover sward, we can reduce our nitrogen input by 100 kilos per hectare, because that extra 100 kilos going from 150 to 250 didn't bring us any benefits in terms of grass growth.
And I mean, across, like I say, for your example, your 40 hectare farm, that's a huge economic benefit.
Absolutely.
You know, in terms of cost savings.
Absolutely.
And just to, I suppose, reiterate something you said in your plot study where you were spreading between 0 and 240 kilos of N. If I've picked you up correctly, where you spread no nitrogen, you fixed 200 kilos of N?
Yeah, on average. So 1 year it was nearly 300 kilos. Another year it was slightly below 200. But yeah, on average across the years we were fixing about 200 kilos.
So where you're spreading a low level of say a low level or no nitrogen, and you have clover inclusion, your clover is working very hard and is creating and fixing its own nitrogen.
So basically the grass and the clover in the sward have a I suppose, a complementary relationship. So first of all, clover fixes nitrogen through bacteria, which are in the roots, in the nodules in the roots. And the bacteria use energy, which comes from the clover through photosynthesis, so carbon for energy. And then it fixes the nitrogen and it makes that available in and around the root area. So the clover uses that nitrogen for growth, but so too can the grass. So they complement each other in the sward. But you do need a reasonable quantity of clover in the sward. So we would be saying you probably need somewhere around 20% on average across the year. And that would be, in our studies, we would have seen in or around that, or even higher. And if we look at some older scientific work, around 20% would be the guideline to get a benefit of clover in terms of herbage production.
When we consider that, spreading less nitrogen, from an environmental perspective, that's a big positive. Talk through the environmental benefits of this type of system.
Okay, so we have looked at the nitrogen use efficiency, for example, of the applied fertiliser from the systems I mentioned earlier, the grass 250, clover 250 and clover 150. And we see that the nitrogen use efficiency is similar enough in the clover 250 and the grass 250 in terms of we're buying in the same amount of fertiliser, we're buying in the same amount of concentrate, and our nitrogen going out in milk is more or less the same. We've slightly more going out in the clover 250 because we produced a bit more milk solids on those. I know we haven't discussed that yet. But on the clover 150, we've found that our end-use efficiency was much higher, because that fertiliser that we were buying in, it was 100 kilos less. We were still growing the same amount of grass and we were still selling the same amount of milk. So we're improving the whole, the use of the applied fertiliser. Now, there is still going to be nitrogen in the system because it's been fixed. And if we're fixing surplus nitrogen to what we need for our grass growth, that can potentially be lost through leaching, the same as fertiliser. So it's basically the soil doesn't mind where the nitrogen comes from. If it's surplus and it can be leached, it will potentially be leached. But there are other benefits in terms of sustainability as well around spreading less fertiliser, because you have, all the energy that's consumed in manufacturing, transporting, and spreading that nitrogen is also removed from the system. So if you were to, I suppose, look at at a life cycle level or a carbon footprint level, you are going to see an impact there as well. And we are going to look at that as well.
If we think about, say, clover, what is the use on farms?
Relatively small. I suppose there's a lot of interest now in the clover work because using clover on farms. So we've shown here in Moore Park that we can successfully keep clover in the sward for 6-7 years after sowing without any requirement to oversow. In Clonakilty, we've also shown very positive results in terms of increase in herbage mass when they have clover in the sward, and also increase in milk solids production. So there are clear benefits for farmers, but I suppose the overall uptake of it, farmers are a little bit slow. They're probably, to take it up, they're probably a little bit nervous of it. There are a number of farmers who have started to use clover in their systems and are very happy with it. And I think, a lot of it's about confidence, and farmers, anything that a farmer has to change, they have to be sure that they're going to get a benefit of that change, which is perfectly understandable because it's their business. So you don't make changes in a business unless you've confidence in that change. But I think we have a good bit of research done now to show that we can get clover to persist. So, that's one thing farmers will say to us, sure, once we put it in, it'll be gone once we start to put a bit of fertiliser on it. But we've shown that that's not the case in well-managed swards. And I suppose the other thing that farmers are nervous with is bloat. Bloat can be a problem. You're probably well aware of that, Louise, that, farmers are nervous. Again, if you have one cow, if you lose a cow from bloat, well, that's a big knock to your business.
And I think, that's a really good point, and something that it's great to discuss. The average farm size in Ireland is in and around the 80, 90 cows. So as you say, that's a big blow to the business.
Yes.
I suppose, have you experienced bloat here, and what are the factors to?
Yeah, so the first few years we were doing the clover grazing studies, we didn't have any problem with bloat, but maybe 4 years ago, we had a big issue with bloat. So that year had been quite mild spring, and there was a lot of clover in the swards. We had one paddock in particular that had a lot of clover, and that was the paddock where we had the problem. So I suppose, we had to take stock and see how we'd manage it, because obviously, losing a cow is, that's that bit gone out of the business. So we've put together some guidelines on things that we do and that work very well. And I suppose the other precaution we do is in times of high clover content, we put bloat oil in the water. So I suppose that's an insurance policy. But the other things we do are, so why cows get bloat on clover is when cows go into a paddock of grass and clover, they tend to preferentially graze the clover. It's if you ever went into the field and took a fist of grass and a fist of clover, you'll notice the clover is much softer than the grass. So there's less fibre in it, and it's easier for the cows to eat. So I suppose it's like giving them a buffet and leaving them pick what they want out of it, and they'll choose the nice bit first. And if you do go into a clover field, you tend to see that, there's patches of clover are grazed and the grass all around it is still there. So one of the things that you can do to minimise bloat is, control the amount of grass or the area of the paddock you're giving them. So let's first go through kind of the perfect storm for clover is you've high clover content, your cows are hungry going into the paddock, and it's very wet. So I've already said, the way clover is softer than the grass, so it's a lower dry matter. There's more liquid in it. If the cows don't eat enough fibre, if they don't have fibre going into the rumen, they have this frothy bloat builds up in the rumen, and then the cows can't get rid of the gases, and that's what causes them to swell. So you need some fibre going in there as well. So if you can restrict the area, give them for a couple of hours just to make them eat grass as well as clover, they're getting a mix of fibre and from the grass, and then they have the clover going in, so that helps. The other thing is make sure your cows aren't very hungry going into a clover paddock. So they shouldn't be grazing below 4 centimetres. If they are, they're probably fairly hungry going into the next paddock, so try and manage that as best you can. And then if it's a very wet morning and there's a lot of clover, the dry matter of what they're eating is going to be low. Again, maybe just give them a little bit less to start with. And then once they have some grass and clover consumed, they could have the rest of the paddock. And then, as I said, we do put bloat oil in as a precaution.
Just to pick up in terms of the controlled area or not giving them the full allocation.
Yeah.
Just talk about a simple strip wire there. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, exactly. Okay, I know it's an extra job, but it's not a job you're going to have to do on many mornings. It's the odd morning in the year when you may have an issue. And I think farmers are good themselves. They pick up fast enough when they think there might be issues around animal health or things like that. So once they get a feel for what's in their paddocks, they'll know if they think there might be an issue. But really your biggest issue will be if the cows are very hungry going in and they go in and they gorge on the clover.
If we turn our attention to, I suppose, animal performance, you've given us a good background now into your plot studies and your experiment with the varied levels of, say, nitrogen spread in a system.
Yep.
What sort of performance did you see from that?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we have 4 years of that grazing study done, and in that we found that our grass clover swards, the cows on those, produced 33 kilos extra milk solids per cow per year. So then, depending on your stocking rate, you can multiply that up. So at our stocking rate, it was around 91 kilos of milk solids per hectare.
And that is with the same amount of concentrate supplementation?
Yes, exactly. Same concentrate supplementation, yeah. And concentrate fed in the first rotation and a little bit in the last rotation. So on average, we fed around 400 kilos across the 4 years.
And I suppose overall milk solids then for the grass clover, you mentioned it's 33 kilograms. higher than, say, a grass only?
Yeah, so they're comparable. So we set this up as an experiment. So we had comparable cows in each group. So same herd profile, same, the cows are randomised according to their milk solids yield at the start of the first 2 weeks post-calving. So calving date, parity, and first 2 weeks milk solids. So the cows are very comparable in terms of the experiment.
And you're saying the quality of the clover plant as a feed, when we compare it to our perennial ryegrass type sward, is the difference, and it's the driver.
It's one of the drivers, and the other driver is that cows on grass clover tend to have a slightly higher intake than cows on grass only. The reason being, so when the cow eats, whatever she eats, it goes into the rumen and it has to be processed through the rumen. So if she's eating something that's bulky with a lot of fibre, which, for example, at this time of year when swards are going stemmy, it restricts the amount she can take in because it has to be processed through the rumen. If you're eating something like clover that's easily broken down because there's less fibre in it, it moves through the rumen faster, so the cow has a greater capacity to eat more. So the benefits or the increase in milk solids is coming from an increase in intake of maybe 1 kilo of dry matter per cow, probably from June onwards or July onwards until September, October, plus the higher quality, particularly in the mid-season.
And in terms of quality, can you give a breakdown in what you mean?
So the grass clover swards tend to have lower fibre content, which results in a higher digestibility of the sward. And we also tend to have higher crude protein content at certain times of the year. Having said that, crude protein wouldn't be a big driver because our pasture-based systems tend not to lack in protein anyway. They usually have enough protein to meet the cow's requirement.
And I guess, finally, Deirdre, you've touched on the issue of bloat, and that being quite a big limitation for some farmers and a barrier to getting into it. I suppose another limitation would be spring growth, and you've mentioned this. And I guess, we're in a situation now where on farms we're focusing primarily on spring calving systems, and we're improving our 6-week calving rate every week. So we're climbing, and the average is, say, in the mid to late 60s now. So we need grass in the spring. What is the situation? How are you managing that in a grass clover situation?
Yeah, so we are seeing a slight reduction in herbage supply in the spring. Okay, there's a year effect. We wouldn't have had any effect this year. It's been a good year all around. But I suppose the reason we see slightly lower herbage production or grass growth over winter and early spring on grass clover swards is perennial ryegrass grows at about 5 degrees soil temperature, whereas white clover needs a soil temperature of about 8 degrees. So obviously it takes the soil a little bit longer to get to that. And if you look at your swards in the spring, grass clover swards, there is going to be a bit of clover there, but a lot of it's below 4 centimetres. So it's not contributing to what's available for the cows to eat. So how we're getting around it basically is we feed some bale silage to the milking cows. So based on our calculations, it's about an extra bale per cow to get over the spring. But again, there's variation within that.
And any strategies to maintain a higher farm cover late in the autumn, will that carry through?
Potentially. We haven't really looked at that, Louise, to be honest. I suppose the only word of warning about carrying a high cover is clover doesn't like to get shaded out in the sward, and there's a risk probably that if you carried very high covers that you would damage the stolon content or the stolon mass in the sward negatively. So because of shading, you would lose some stolon mass, or you'd reduce the stolon's capacity to grow and reproduce, and that's how the clover persists in the sward. So as it stands, we haven't looked at altering autumn management. We still start closing around the 10th of October, and we follow the targets then with 66% closed, 70% closed at the end of November, and the remainder by the start of December. And again, same spring rotation plan, general rules in the spring.
And just to finish up with that extra bale of silage per cow, when have you seen practically you've put that in? Is that February, March, April you're inputting that silage?
Probably March. Not really April. No, we haven't really had. Generally, we find once the swards are grazed, they grow at the same rate as the grass clover.
So your pinch point with a clover
is end of February, start of March. Yeah. So basically, if you're following your spring rotation planner, and you know what herbage you have available to graze on a day, if you don't have enough, you have to supplement with silage at that stage.
So finally, just to recap, Deirdre, have you say a top 3 tips for dairy farmers who are thinking about including clover in their swards?
Yeah, and I suppose this is probably one we actually haven't discussed, but if you want to go a clover system, you really need to have clover in all your paddocks. Okay, because if you don't, you're swapping in and out of clover, no clover, and it's a bit dicey because you might be running into bloat problems. Second top tip is to graze your swards well. So follow just the normal grazing management rules. Graze tight in the first and last rotation down to 3.5 centimetres. And if possible, obviously depends on weather and soil and so on. And then for the main season, post-grazing sward height of 4 centimetres, 18 to 21 day rotations. Pull out your surpluses as bales. And the last one then is you can reduce your fertiliser nitrogen. I wouldn't be advising to reduce it specifically in the spring because, as we discussed, Emma Louise, there is a pinch point there in the spring in terms of growth because of the lower temperature at which clover grows. So it would be in probably May, June, July, August time is when you can reduce your fertiliser.
That's great. Thank you, Deirdre.
Thanks, Emma Louise.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast. And my thanks to Deirdre Hennessy for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple and Google Podcasts, as well as Spotify. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.